to the Identity Heroes podcast. This podcast is by Identity Heroes for Identity Heroes. We will interview leaders and practitioners in the field to share useful news, insights, and practical advice for overcoming top identity challenges. By hearing from leaders and practitioners, we hope that you can learn tips and techniques for addressing your most critical challenges. This podcast is all about giving back to the identity community and, most importantly, the people who are at the front lines fighting cybercrime in today's businesses. And now, your hosts.
Welcome to Identity Heroes podcast. This is Aldo, and we have Brad here. And I'm very, very excited to get this podcast inaugurated and started. And this hits close to home because our first guest is Atul Tulshibagwale, CTO of SGNL, which he's a very, very good friend of mine. He's actually, I'm just going to be upfront and transparent. He is actually my identity hero. And he knows that ever since we worked at TrustGenix. But Atul, welcome. It is an honor to have you on the podcast today. How's it going? How are you doing?
Going great, and thank you for having me. And it's a special kind of responsibility to be the first guest on your podcast. So I hope I live up to your expectations.
Oh, of course. You always do.
I'm sure you will. So, Atul, so you were involved with TrustGenix and the early days of SAML. Can you tell us a little bit how did that get started? Or how did you get involved with that?
Sure. I think the story goes a little further back, if you can believe that. Is when I was actually one of the first engineers at VeriSign, and we were trying for a long time, for about 5 years, to get people to use certificates on their endpoints. Like this could, at that time, was exclusively desktop computers and laptops, right? And we worked with Microsoft, Netscape, Adobe, you name it, right? Every company out there to make sure that the experience of the user side was good enough for certificates to be used. And it turned out that that story was not going really well, right? Although there was a lot of interest because of the security, there were practical issues that came in the way. And so the model kind of evolved to where, okay, maybe you can't use certificates on the client, but then can you simplify the experience for the user by not having them to have to type in their passwords everywhere, right? And that's sort of the single sign-on promise that was being talked about at that time. And what happened was Microsoft kind of introduced this idea of a passport service, which you could use a Microsoft password to log you into anything. And that kind of rallied the industry into saying that, look, maybe we shouldn't be focusing on a vendor specific proprietary solution. We should actually be looking at, how do we do this in a standards based way? And so the Liberty Alliance was formed out of that, that need. And I remember attending the very first meeting that we had in Orlando, in Florida, where we were discussing how, federated identity, which was sort of a very new term at that time, could happen. And we looked at, there was a spec called SAML 1.0, which we were sort of considering as the message format. And we were figuring out the flows, like how can the browsers redirect between each other and figure out between services, and figure out how do we convey that information through a SAML formatted token. So the exchange of information was Liberty Alliance, and the format was SAML 1.0. Well, after I think a couple of years of that, a few things happened, right? Maybe 1 year of that. So what happened was VeriSign, my previous employer, decided that this wasn't for them because customers were looking for an on-premise solution at that time. They weren't looking for what was being called an online service at that time, right? Nowadays we call it a cloud service. So customers were looking for an on-premise solution, and VeriSign kind of clearly did not believe that on-premise solution was something that they could continue or they could offer. And so I kind of branched off and decided that maybe I want to start my own company, and that's how TrustGenX was born. And then the other thing that happened was, Liberty Alliance kind of contributed their work to Oasis, and the standard called SAML 2.0 was born out of that, which was pretty much very similar to what we had in Liberty Alliance, but it was all sort of merged into this one big spec called the SAML 2.0 core specification, right? And so that's kind of the story there. And what people were thinking at that time is, it wasn't quite clear how that was going to be embodied in software, right? And so I remember, like, we were drawing all these components. So you have your LDAP directory here, and you have your SSO system, which is a proprietary single sign-on system here. And how do we, like, now convey this to a third party? And there were a bunch of components that would do the SAML generation and all those things, and the parsing and all that. And I remember drawing a circle around that on a whiteboard, saying, that is, I think, what can be called a federation server, right? And that circle, that idea that becomes a federation server, became like the all the rage, because now every company in the world has a federation server, right? Like, I mean, everyone in the identity space. But that sort of was the humble beginning of all that, where it started. And it was exciting to be a part of the first sort of federated identity spec that was being used at scale. Our company contributed to the spec, as well as sort of we were active participants in the interoperability events that were taking place. And then, eventually HP acquired TrustGenX, and, we were a part of HP after that. And, they had the Select Federation product of their own, which was basically our product, kind of continued by HP.
That's pretty interesting. I remember I cut my teeth early on SAML. What I think is interesting is the sort of the life of SAML. And it started where, the early 2000s, you talk to a customer and they would say, oh, there's no way we can't have identities, in another system, or we can't allow just anyone at all to access our system. And, then it got to the point where if you weren't talking about SAML, you weren't in the identity space at all. And then I think SAML sort of took a kind of a Monty Python route, and that it was, it's just a flesh wound. SAML's dead. SAML's not dead. And I'd say every customer that I work with still has a really heavy investment in SAML. You see a lot more around OIDC and OAuth these days, but I think that SAML still has a pretty heavy presence, for most organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Um, I think there was a lot of concern about, you know, outsourcing your authentication, which is considered to be a core relationship between an organization and their users, right? In many cases, those are customers.
Mm-hmm.
And so where SAML really started to take effect was in sort of the benefit space, where you may have a dental insurance or a 401k, or health insurance kind of situation, where all you're doing is, you're not fearing that some intermediary is going to, like, disenfranchise you, because the users are already sort of belonging to that organization that is authenticating them. And so, you all you're doing is, instead of having to re-authenticate them yourself, you're just,
Right.
like, relying on SAML. And so the first use cases I remember were all around 401k and insurance and things like that. So you're absolutely right. I mean, there is still a lot of reluctance about extending federated identity to customer implementations because of these business concerns. But for the workforce, I think it works great.
Yeah, agreed. I think it all comes down to trust, and you see the same conversations in SAML integrations, in OIDC integrations, and even in kind of the future tech or the future world with decentralized identity, where you have the three party issuer, the holder, the verifier. The verifier, which would be the service provider, still has to trust and take ownership of of that allowing access. So it's at no point are they, I guess, delegating authority or delegating access out to a different party, because the trust or the deciding who gets access to the resource or deciding whether to allow the user in is still ultimately up to that service provider.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. SAML does not, at least doesn't have to indicate anything about the access restrictions about a user there. It's really just about authentication. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, you could include information in the SAML token about capabilities and all that of the user, but that's not necessary.
Yeah, agreed.
So that, if you don't mind, Brad, that brought up a couple questions in my mind around, SAML and how everything has transpired since then. Atul, what were the challenges of back then? I know, we were trying to also extend SAML based authentication into some sort of coarse-grained authorization, where customers wanted not only the authentication piece, but they were moving into maybe using, for those of you who know SAML well, attribute statements to communicate attributes about the user or the principal that was being federated. And the service provider typically then use those attributes to grant or deny access to certain areas of the application or certain functions of the application. Can you kind of walk us through, how that has changed since then, and why isn't SAML enough today?
Yeah, and I think the attribute assertions, like you mentioned, like that attribute statements or whatever it was called in SAML, didn't really come about initially, right? Like initially, people were
Mm-hmm.
just talking about authentication, right? And once they had that going, I think then people started to think, okay, it, it's not enough for me to just know who this user is. I also need to know what that issuing party has authorized that user to do, and as a result, you have some of this attribute statements. Now, fortunately, the world where SAML was born, which was in the Liberty Alliance project, was heavily, sort of influenced by telecom providers, like the big mobile
Yeah.
operators of that age, and they wanted to bring in a lot of this, authorization capabilities into the standard. So the standard already supported it, right? It's only that nobody really cared about it until much later, right?
Mm.
And what's happening with SAML now is that there is there is a lot of confusion about how you can actually express something in terms of attributes, right? There needs to be a lot of offline agreement on, okay, this is what I mean when I say this in my SAML token, right? And that point to point kind of trust uh, hasn't scaled that well, and I think that is one of the reasons why SAML is really just about authentication and not so much about authorization even today.
Mm. That's great. That's great. Then one more question I have around that is, how do you see the level of maturity, authorization maturity in our customers today, as it relates to one, the capabilities that they need in or where I would say the capabilities that they are looking for an authorization or authentication system to provide versus where they're at today, specifically in that landscape? Because I particularly see, um, the maturity of customers that I deal with, um, be on the lower side in regards to externalizing authorization from the application itself, or even in determining what is the best solution or solution and implementation approach, for lack of a better term, to leverage, whether it be, CAPE, which is what we're going to be talking about. For those of you who do not know what CAPE is Continuous Access Evaluation Profile, and actually Atul is the inventor of that. So we're very, very blessed to have him on the podcast to talk about that. But I do see, different levels of maturity depending on the type of business, the type of vertical that a customer is in, and the way they go about providing identity services to either their workforce or customers. So I wanted your thoughts on that whole picture, if you could.
Yeah. No, I think authorization is it's an interesting area because I think first of all, what's happening is that there's gradually a recognition building that this cannot be the way we do things, right? I think
Mm,
that recognition itself has not been there, right? So I think initially when you ask people about authorization, it's like, oh yeah, we have these roles, and we gotta add members manually to those roles, and oh, don't worry, we'll periodically review them and make sure that the roles won't have the wrong people in them. And oh yeah, and we have these audit checks, and we're gonna do all this great processes around like integrating everything so that when you add someone in one role, they'll sort of automatically get propagated wherever it is. And a few years later, we are realizing that this is way too complicated, right? It's not
mhm,
really how we can scale a business, right? And I think that realization is, even in the last couple of years that Signal has existed, we've actually seen this transformation from people not having recognition for the problem to saying, yes, maybe there's a better way of doing the things, right? And I think the closest example, and I use this when I talk to people quite a bit, is the closest example I feel is like the tape backup world, right? Where previously people would depend a lot on tape backup, right? And they had these extensive systems to create tape backups, and there were like all these differential files that you would like add. You would do a daily backup, and then you would add the differences every day, and then every 7 days you would create a new backup and things like that, right? There was a lot of work in that area, and the realization was that when it actually breaks down, right, when you actually need that tape backup, it's not there for you most of the time, right? It doesn't work, right? And so all that investment that was happening in the tape backup was sort of being questioned, right? And along came this whole idea of, hey, why don't we just do hard disk based backup or disaster recovery, right? We don't even think about it as backup anymore, right? We think about it as disaster recovery, right? Or hot backup, or switch over failover kind of systems, right? And that's the same thing I think is happening in the authorization space, where
mm,
you have a model that you've relied on, and you're realizing as more and more of these cyber breaches happen, that when the time comes, it's actually not doing what it's supposed to, right? And now you need a different approach at things. That is where I think the externalization of authorization, providing a consistent way of doing authorization across your enterprise, being able to scale it, being able to like not have manual processes to do either role memberships or reviews, being able to have good audits, all these things come into the picture.
I think that's a really good analogy. I really hadn't thought about that, but I've been fortunate that I never had to recover from tape and find that it was missing or find that it didn't work. So but I think that was, I'm sure a lot of people have encountered that. Um, do you also think, Atul, that part of the problem is in the tool sets or the frameworks that we have? So, in the world of roles by themselves are really good for coarse-grained authorization scenarios. But that becomes the hammer, or that becomes the tape backup, and so everyone says, oh, okay, well we're going to use RBAC, and we're going to implement roles, and then an application says, well, that's not enough for me. I need something more coarse grain, and because it's
Yeah.
the only tool in the toolbox, then we say, okay, we'll just create another role for you, and then you have the role explosion scenario that everybody talks about. So then we have attribute-based access control. We have all these different frameworks, and everybody looks at it like, which one framework should I use versus how do I implement a hybrid solution? Do you think that that's an answer to the problem of being able to mix the frameworks, or do you think that there's another solution out there that we're all eventually going to get to?
No, you're absolutely right. I don't think it's a one size fits all at all, right? I think it's you're going to have everything from like even ACLs roles to more temporary kind of assignments, like what we're calling continuous access management at Signal. But you may have heard the terms more like REBAC, like a relationship based access management, or NGAC,
Sure.
and many of these. There's a lot of alphabet soup out there, but some of these things can coexist. For example, if you have a cloud service that is critical to your operations, right? You're going to have an ACL, a very very tiny ACL of a few users in your organization that control access to that cloud infrastructure, right? And that's going to coexist with the sort of the role-based access control that gives you the birthright access to even access those systems, right? Like, who has access to Workday is probably going to be a RBAC kind of system, right? You don't need anything more fancy than that at that point. But then when you get down to, okay, who can actually look at the personal details of so and so employee, that needs to be a very dynamic and very sensitive kind of operation that you cannot really capture in a more static sort of way. So you cannot say that, oh, I belong to the HR department, so I'm just going to go and look at everybody's personal details, right? That should not be allowed, right? And that's where you need the more dynamic and fine-grained authorization. So I think absolutely it is not a one-size-fits-all. It's a coexistence story, right? And I think that what we're seeing now is that are the ill effects of trying to apply the RBAC hammer, as you said, to every authorization nail, essentially. Right?
Right. Great. Thank you for that. I'm of the opinion that on the authentication side, the protocols or the standards like SAML and OAuth and OIDC were the tools that allowed the industry to basically say, hey, we've solved authentication. And that's a very common attitude across the board is we've solved authentication. I mean, there's always going to be additional MFA and things like that. But I think, having those frameworks was what enabled us to get to that point. Do you think that there is a common standard like that on the authorization side, or do you think that we'll eventually get to that point? What are you seeing around that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's a great point, because I think right now the authorization world is where authentication was before SSO, right? Everybody kind of used to roll their own like login password kind of
Mm-hmm.
authentication, and nobody was supporting SAML or OIDC. And now here you are, where everybody basically just expects that there will be some federated identity, but they would still be like able to do some fallback kind of authentication if they have to, right? Like that's kind of how it works.
Sure.
Now, mapping that to where we are with authorization, right? Like today, you expect every application to basically make its own authorization decisions, right? So that's one problem. That results in a few things, right? One is that there is sometimes a misinterpretation of what a role means for that application versus what it was actually defined for, and so it causes confusion as to whether somebody should be in that role or not. Now you take the you take the approach that, oh, this is good enough and I'm going to just use this role, which causes sort of policy violations. Or you could say, oh, I'm going to create a different role for this, and then that causes sort of a role explosion, right? So
Right.
none of the choices are great, right? And so um, trying to externalize authorization in order to be able to not have to make that decisions inside of every application or every service is a great starting step, right? And there you can think of two possible ways of standardizing things, right? One is you need something that will work at the time of access, right? So right when somebody's trying to access a critical resource, you're able to delegate that decision to some external party, and you can get that decision back in a very reasonable time, sort of period of time, and say, okay, yeah, within a few milliseconds I'm going to get the answer to this, and I'm going to make a decision based on that answer that I get, right? So that you can say is a kind of a synchronous way of doing things, right? So we are doing some work in the auth working group in the OpenID Foundation, where I've submitted a proposal to define an API between what is known as the policy decision point and the policy enforcement point, right? You can think of the policy enforcement point as being your application, right, or your service where you need the authorization decision. And the policy decision point is sort of a more centralized service which can, consider all the latest information and give you the decision. Now, it is a few things very critical here, right? Because the policy enforcement point needs to convey the context accurately to the policy decision point so that it knows exactly what is being accessed and why somebody is trying to access that. And then the policy decision point needs to have all the right data to answer that question. But from a standards point of view, the policy enforcement point needs to make sure that that answer comes in a timely fashion so that it can depend on that in order to make its processing, right? And modern cloud architectures allow for, very low latency communication, and we should be able to leverage all that in a spec like what we are thinking of today in the odds and working group. So that's one part of the answer. The second part is where you have these disjointed islands of communication, um, where you may not have like the same low latency communication available between different components, right? For example, if you have a SaaS service in the cloud and you have a IDP that is a different organization, you cannot expect the SaaS service to go out to the IDP for every sort of access decision. So you need something that is able to convey that decision in a more asynchronous kind of way, right? And that is what is being done by the continuous access evaluation profile, where you can convey this information asynchronously across these components, right? So that you don't have to um, be there at the time the decision is needed, but you can convey the decision when you have changed something about the user's session properties, for example.
Right. So, you just mentioned Cape there, and Aldo sort of teased a little bit about it before. But why don't we take a moment now and sort of unpack that profile? What exactly is that a protocol? Is that a standard? Is that a profile? Maybe unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, it's been a persistent point of confusion. Cape actually started as continuous access evaluation protocol, right? So it was
Okay.
the full protocol, including the mechanisms for conveying information and all that, right? So what happened was back in the beginning of 2019, I published a blog post when I was in Google that described or postulated how we could do things. And the blog post was actually titled Continuous Access Evaluation Protocol, right? And it defined a mechanism, that how this can be done. And there was a very enthusiastic response to that across the industry. And then we met as an informal group a few times. I think a few times in Google, a few times outside of Google, I think in Microsoft and some other places. And so we had this great momentum around Cape. And in this case, the P was for protocol. And then we found out that there's this parallel standard called RISC in the
Mhm.
OpenID Foundation, which also used the same kind of mechanisms, right? They were trying to solve a different problem, which is about the account takeover and account sort of security problem, whereas Cape was trying to solve the session security problem, right? And so we felt like, okay, look, we are trying to solve two different problems, but the mechanisms that we want, the asynchronous publish and subscribe kind of mechanisms, are the same, right? And so why don't we come together, define a common framework, and then define these as protocols or profiles on top of that framework, right? And so that's how the shared signals framework was born. And that became a new working group in the OpenID Foundation. It kind of replaced the old RISC group, and on top of that framework, now you have a continuous access evaluation profile. Now the Cape as it stands today is just a bunch of events that leverage the shared signals framework, right? And a risk is another set of events that leverages the shared signals framework. And the risk events are more around account security, whereas the Cape events are more around session security, or sessions that are in flight, basically. So yeah, that's in a nutshell, sort of, it's a profile on top of the shared signals framework.
Okay. So they're not necessarily competing profiles, but they're more kind of two sides to the same coin, or at least they could play together fairly nicely in the same environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's happening is the shared signals framework actually is a more generic asynchronous publish and subscribe framework, right? So it doesn't really have to be restricted to just cape or risk, right? It can be used as a generic, webhooks kind of framework, right? So if you have an API and you want to say, hey, I'm giving you this answer right now, but it may change and I want to notify you when that answer changes, you can use, SSF to do that.
Okay. So,
And yeah,
oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. You were about to say. Keep
no,
going.
yeah, and cape and risk you can think are just two existing applications of that shared signals framework. There can be more.
Okay. Okay. So it's not even limited just to two of those
Yeah.
profiles. So it's interesting, and I was lucky enough that uh, I was able to see a demo of this last week, and it's pretty interesting. Could you unpack for everybody a little bit more, like more, I guess, exactly how does this work, or how would a customer, if they're interested in it, how do you go about it? How do you get it? How do you
Yeah.
implement it? How do you use it? You know,
Yeah.
describe a scenario where
Yeah.
you would a customer could do it.
Yeah, I think the why is also very interesting, right? Because what's happening is that federated identity protocols, right, like SAML or YDC, came about in a world where pretty much everybody was tethered to a sort of a desktop or laptop kind of situation, right, where the online activity used to be limited. Now we live in a sort of a fully online world where
Mhm.
everybody is constantly using their mobile phones or laptops or whatever to access services that um, it always changes, like your access posture is always changing, right? And as companies are moving to the zero trust world, right, where there is a lot of emphasis on verifying the properties at the time of access, right? That's what zero trust is all about. And if you don't have a mechanism to actually convey the information to where it's needed, then you're making decisions based on some old data, like when the user logged in, and you're not aware of what has happened since then, right? And so, for example, let's say I use my mobile phone to log into a CRM system, right? I've signed in using my employer's single sign-on service, and I've logged in to a CRM system. Now, let's say I go back to my employer's single sign-on server and I change my password, right? Or I change the MFA that I'm using, right? There's some change like that happens. There is no mechanism today. I mean, before Cape, that would be able to convey that information that, hey, now this user's credential has changed, and you need to take some action based on that on your end, right? There was no way to convey that before Cape, and that's why Cape is, I think, critical to zero trust, because I think without that you're not able to make those instant decisions that you need to make for zero trust on the most current data. Otherwise, you're always working with some old data, right? And that's why Cape is so important. Now, if you wanted to get this today, right, I think there's a few possibilities, right? There's a little bit of open source out there where you have a site called sharedsignals.guide, which is hosted by Cisco. They have some open source components in there. And then you also have cape.dev, which is hosted by my company Signal, where we have an open source Cape receiver in Go, where you can actually build your own Cape receiver using that, right? Now you're going to see some, very powerful announcements shortly. For example, Apple in the latest WWDC that happened last year, uh, sort of said that if you wanted to use a custom identity provider with their Apple Business Manager service, then you have to use the shared signals framework, right? And they're using the CAPE events for that. Now, corresponding to that, Okta, which is in Apple's term, what is a custom identity provider? Okta announced their support for CAPE, right? So if you now get Okta and you're using Apple Business Manager, under the covers, they're going to be using CAPE automatically, right? So and you don't actually have to do anything to get that, right? And so I think what I would recommend for uh, technology users is that, hey, when you're evaluating vendors or when you're sort of deciding your strategy, you need to sort of make sure that at least on the roadmap of the companies that are offering you the software, they have these kinds of things supported so that you get better security outcomes in everybody working together, right?
Right.
It's not sufficient that one vendor has some proprietary way of talking to two other vendors, and between the three of them they have good security. That's not good enough, right? You need to be able to interoperate with everything that's out there, and that's only possible using an open standard like Key.
Although I feel like I've been monopolizing the time a little bit. Did you have some questions?
These are all great questions. I think you covered quite a bit. I think the biggest, question here is, Atul, what from your experience and perspective, what do you think the industry adoption curve would look like for something like CAPE?
Yeah, I think we released the first draft, I think, a couple of years back now. We were very encouraged initially when we saw Cisco and Box announce interoperability using CAPE, which was an amazing announcement. I think it happened in the RSA conference in 2022, which was fantastic. What happened was there was a little bit of a drop in the momentum after that. And truth be told, I think Microsoft implemented CAPE internally within their systems even before the standard was out, right? And so it's based on a sort of a working draft that sort of we had at that time, but they haven't really made it possible for other companies to interoperate with them using CAPE, but they have the functional equivalent of CAPE that is being used internally. Now, what sort of rejuvenated that whole thing was the Apple and Okta announcements that happened earlier last year. And now I think what's happening is we are seeing a lot of momentum based on the Gartner announcement that they're going to host a CAPE interoperability event at the Gartner IAM Summit in London in March. And so, just a couple of weeks or less than a couple of weeks away now. And we are gearing up for that. We have about 8 implementers who have signed up, committed to the interoperability event. And so I think it's going to be a great start for many companies to showcase what they have, and for potential users of those products to see how they can leverage that in their environments. And I think this actually can be an inflection point for 4K. And although it's been sort of steadily building over these years, I think this is the moment when I think it can really get into the mainstream.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, you've heard it here first. From the mouth of Atul, inventor of CAPE. But all kidding aside, now this is great. I mean, we've discussed, SAML. We've discussed, how SAML has been used in the past, how its evolution has gone through, authentication and kind of coarse-grained authorization with service provider configurations. We've discussed where the high-level gaps are with SAML. Obviously, in 45 minutes, we're not going to be able to get into a lot of the details, but those are kind of subjects for future podcasts where we're going to start actually showcasing some of these concepts in practical, demonstrations, practical use cases, and so forth. But it's great to have a tool to kind of inaugurate this podcast, because he's been at the forefront of authentication with SAML, as well as authorization, and now is at the forefront of authorization with real-time session communication with or by using CAPE, which is going to be important because that brings in a very interesting real-time nature to authorization, aside from the continuous access management and zero standing privilege approach that Signal brings into bear. And actually, this is a good segue, Atul. If you could take maybe a quick 4 minutes to describe Signal and what Signal does and what it brings to the industry.
Yeah, sure. So I think Signal was sort of born out of some of our frustration at Google about sort of how we can get past these manual ways of doing things for granting or revoking permissions, right? And so I think the realization was that organizations typically have this information already in some business processes that they are already relying on, right? For example, you assign work to people based on, let's say, a ticketing system, right? Or you assign people to certain cases, or pull requests, or customers in your CRM, or whatever it is that might be, right? So this information already exists in your organization, right? So that's one problem that we thought could be solved. The other problem was that we don't think that the roles, or set based approaches, right, where you're creating a role and then you're adding members to that role, and then maybe you can use a more efficient system like Zanzibar to like denormalize those sets into like individual permissions and then get fast responses and all that. We don't think those things are expressive enough to capture the real world relationships, that how we think about policies, right? So that's the other aspect. And the third aspect is that you need to have very strong, like, reliability and communication, because this is an inline system. You need to be able to provide answers within milliseconds in order to be able to deliver a reliable authorization system, right? You definitely want to get to a point where it can be a close fail system, where the system cannot actually work without the authorization system being there, right? And all these properties are embodied in Signal, right? Because we ingest data continuously from your business systems of record, right? We bring it into a very high performance graph, and the graph has these amazing properties of like being able to replicate itself into wherever you need it to be, provide millisecond responses, because all the data, finally it's about graph traversal. And the graph is so expressive that you can now define policies in a way that are more human readable, right? And then we have this great system by which we can compose different reusable components like snippets, and then create these policies. And the other consequence of all this is that because you're making these decisions in a central location, which is the Signal service, you are able to now produce real-time audits, right, based on the decisions that you've made, like who got access, who didn't get access. So it's very easy to prove compliance to any existing stated policy, because you will actually see the accesses that were allowed or disallowed, right? And so I think it becomes a far more robust system than what exists today. Sorry, I get very passionate when we talk about Signal, because
That's good.
it starts feeling like a sales pitch, but it's just coming from a place of conviction.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I can certainly relate to that, being that I'm also at Signal, right? So, but yeah, I mean, it's been really awesome to be uh, part of this industry since the year 2000. So, and even more awesome, if that's a word, to be in close contact and proximity with people like Brad here, my co-host, and yourself, Atul, that have always been pushing the envelope forward, or pushing the bar forward and higher. And in your case, helping us understand how to leverage new standards in authorization, and even in session event communication and shared signals is really critical, because ultimately at least for me personally speaking, this, I also get very passionate, and this is a labor of love for me. And I know Brad also gets very passionate about this, and it's really a labor for our customers and people, what we're calling identity heroes, who are at the front line, battling cyber attacks, quite frankly. So, whether it's coming through phishing or you name your vector, that this is something that the industry really has to provide. So, tons of kudos to you and the Signal team, and of course, kudos to Brad, and huge blessing for Brad to accept to be a co-host in this podcast, because it's going to be an interesting year for us. But just to wrap things up a bit here, we like to talk about some takeaways. One big takeaway that I personally get here is, it's only the beginning, right? We're just touching the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the authorization function in the identity landscape or ecosystem of challenges, and it looks like it's going to be a very interesting journey. It may be a long journey, it may not, and frankly, I think CAPE may be an accelerator to start this conversation moving forward, and to actually get practical solutions out into the industry and in the customer's hands. Number two, we need to start thinking of more on a dynamic zero standing privileges kind of thought pattern, because I know it's very natural for us to think about role-based access control, attribute-based access control, which comes very quick to our minds because we've been doing this for so long. And I think our audience and some of the identity heroes out there, that's the first thing they think of is, oh yeah, RBAC, ABAC. And now dealing with policy-based access control, and then REBAC, or relationship-based access control. And it was important to kind of take that takeaway of, hey, it's not one specific framework or approach. It's actually all of the above, depending on your, audience, whether it's customers or workforce, and depending on the application type, and depending on your requirements for the application as well. But the other major takeaway is, it seems like in order to start moving towards a zero trust architecture, you're almost kind of, force is not a good word, but you're kind of left to implement a dynamic system that can easily adjust to real-time context coming from whatever the protected system is, whether it be an application, cloud service provider, a workload that's running anywhere. It could be a Kubernetes cluster, etc. But I think the days of making static assumptions of what access should be in place are gone. And that's something I strictly believe in. It has to be, since the beginning, actually, since I started in this industry, I've always wondered, why don't we do things much more dynamically? Like we need to respond to context, and that's been a little pet peeve of mine. So it's good that we're now as veterans in this industry, as well as colleagues and all the heroes that are listening. They're all focusing now, it looks like, on we need to start transitioning at this point. So those are the key takeaways. Brad, do you have any takeaways that you have?
Yeah, actually, what you just said is a great segue. So there's a lot of people working towards this. Atul, you mentioned AuthZen. I know you and I both are in the ID Pro membership in that Slack channel. You've recently created an authorization channel specific to for these discussions. There's an authorization conference that's being worked on behind the scenes, and a lot of really great people are putting a lot of effort into, I think, standardizing authorization, much like the industry did with OAuth and SAML and OIDC. So I think that kind of wraps it up. But we do have one. Here's the most challenging question of all. This is where we really, right at the end, we really get into some hard hitting stuff. That's all. So, like Aldo said, the whole concept of this show is identity heroes, which is everybody that puts effort into the identity space. who in your career have you encountered that you would consider a hero or someone that you look up to, or who would you want us to talk to next? Who would you? We joked about like an ice bucket challenge. Who should we force onto the show next?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a great question. I mean, off the top of my head, what comes to mind is I've worked a lot with Michael Jones from
Hmm.
I guess he used to work at Microsoft. Now he is on his own. He has been instrumental in sort of some of the key standards that we use today in identity, and I think I always look up to him for advice on like how to navigate the standards world and how to sort of contribute to it. So I think that would be a great person to have on this podcast.
Right.
And if I look outside of the standards world and I see around if like who have built some of the really expansive systems that we all use today, which are related to identity. One thing that comes to mind is the sign in with Google system, right? Where everybody uses sign in with Google. And I know a person named Mayank Upadhyay, who has been instrumental in bringing that system online and making it successful. And so I wonder if he would be available to to join this podcast as well. So it's
Well, thank you for that. We'll certainly reach out to both of them, and if you can help us with introductions, we'd love that. Always open to recommendations on different people we could talk to. Atul, just want to thank you very much for agreeing to be the first guest. I think we need to get a plaque or something made,
Yeah.
the first guest award.
A
But
t-shirt.
where
Don't
can
forget t-shirts.
yeah, we'll have to get a T-shirt. Exactly. Where assuming that it's okay for people to reach out to you in if they have questions or they want to talk to you about it, how can people reach you or how can people find you out on the internet?
sure. So I'm sure you'll put the links to my LinkedIn and
Hmm.
Twitter or X accounts out there.
Yes. Hmm.
And they can also email me at CTO at SGNL.ai. So Chief Technology Officer, CTO at SGNL.ai.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thank you very much. It was great talking to you. This was, I think, really interesting, and really it was nice being able to dig into CAPE and learn a little bit more about your background.
Well, thank you
Absolutely.
so much for having me. I'm especially honored to be the first guest on this podcast. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much.
As
All
always,
right.
much love and respect for you, Atul, and of course my co-host Brad. Much love and respect to you, as you are also one of my identity heroes. So
Oh, so,
upwards and onwards, and
Yeah.
I'm really looking forward to future episodes of this podcast. Thank you, everybody.
absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. Wish
All
you
right.
the very best for it. All right.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right.